The night was a silent, brooding kind. The kind that makes you notice the small creaks in the walls, the faint hum of electricity, and every little sound that usually goes unnoticed. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic, even breathing of my wife beside me. We lived a simple life, out in the countryside. No extravagant comforts, no distractions, just us, our animals, and our chores. Not much money to speak of, either, but we managed. Or at least I thought we did. Earlier that day, I'd been out working on the old pickup truck. I'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to turn a wrench until I got down under that rusted frame and took a look at what years of neglect had done to it. It had sat untouched for too long, and I figured fixing it up to sell would help with bills that never seemed to end. My wife was nearby, taking care of the cows. I could hear her humming softly, a tune as familiar as her face, as comforting as the scent of her lavender soap after a long day. We had a quiet dinner like most nights. We talked about things that didn't matter much but filled the silences. The forecast, the neighbor's new fence, and my struggles with that truck. She listened with her usual patience, nodding along, her gaze steady and calm. That's one thing about her. She'd always been the picture of modesty, never one to complain, never one to bring herself up in a conversation. If anything, she was a little too reserved, too quiet sometimes. Even after 4 years of marriage, there were things about her that I felt I hadn't quite learned. After dinner, she cleared the dishes, and I settled into the living room with the faint thought that maybe, just maybe, we were doing all right. Then, as we were getting ready for bed, my phone rang, and her name flashed on the screen. Boss Thomas. A name I hadn't seen in a while. Not since he'd fired me a few months back when I couldn't keep up with the work on his farm. Thomas owned a spread 10 times the size of ours, a place worth more than I'd see in my life. But the way he treated people, the way he'd treated me, left a bitter taste. So, seeing his name light up my screen stirred something in me that I hadn't felt in a while. I glanced at my wife as I picked up the phone, and for a second, I thought I saw something flash across her face, a look I couldn't place. But it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by her usual, soft expression. "Hello," I said, trying to keep my voice even. We exchanged a few pleasantries, and I braced myself for some offhand insult, something casual to remind me of my place. But instead, his tone was different, almost friendly. "Hey, I'm calling because I'm throwing a little party tomorrow night," he said, his voice easy, almost too relaxed. "I'd like you to come by, you and the wife. Be good to see you both." It was the last thing I'd expected. Why he'd want me there, or what I'd get out of it, was beyond me, but there was an air of insistence in his voice. Something about the way he spoke made it sound like a command disguised as an invitation. After hanging up, I sat back and let out a long sigh. Tomorrow was Thomas's birthday, and I'd completely forgotten. The man had just invited us to his place for his big celebration, and here I was, barely able to scrape together a few dollars for gas, much less a birthday gift for my former boss. It felt like one of those quiet, gut-wrenching reminders that life was still holding me by the collar, reminding me where I stood. My wife, who'd been tidying up beside me, looked over with a mix of curiosity and something else, maybe excitement. I told her about the call, and her face lit up, her eyes widening like I hadn't seen in ages. She looked almost giddy, a little sparkle lighting her up from the inside. She clasped her hands together and laughed. An easy laugh, so genuine I couldn't help but feel a little tug in my chest. But the look on her face changed fast when I mentioned we didn't have money for a gift. "I don't want to show up to his place empty-handed," I said, more to myself than to her. I hated the thought of walking into that big, fine house of his without something decent to give back. Even if he wouldn't miss it, I'd feel every single dollar we couldn't afford. She nodded slowly, her face falling, and I saw her disappointment settle in. She was quiet for a moment, just standing there with a little furrow in her brow. That was when it hit me. That truck in the yard. It had to be worth something, even if it was barely holding itself together. Maybe if I pushed a bit tomorrow, got on the phone with a few folks I knew, I could at least find someone who'd buy it for parts. Or even better, maybe a full buyer who'd take it as is. And with whatever money I could pull together, I'd get Thomas something that wouldn't embarrass us. Even something small but decent. I could see that thought lifted her spirits a little, and that was worth it. When I crawled into bed that night, she was already settled in, her head resting on the pillow, that faint glimmer of excitement still in her eyes. She was beautiful, lying there in the half-dark, looking at me with a softness that made me feel like I'd do anything to make her happy. I knew this party mattered to her, and if I could, I'd make sure she felt like we belonged there, even if we were dirt poor and showed up with a cheap gift. As I lay there, going over the plan in my head, I mentally ran through a list of people I'd call in the morning, guys who worked in cars, some farmers around here who might need a cheap vehicle. I already had a few names in mind, and if I could get a good lead, maybe this thing would work out. With that little bit of resolve, I felt something settle in me. I could make this happen. And tomorrow, when we walked into that house, we'd do it with our heads held high. The morning came early, the kind of dark, cool morning that felt heavy with the day's work ahead. I was up at 6, the sun barely creeping over the horizon as I headed straight for that old truck. It had to start today, no other option. I climbed in, turned the key, and nothing. Just a pathetic sputter and the groan of an engine that had seen better days, if it had ever had those to begin with. But I wasn't about to give up. This truck was my ticket to making things right. For the next hour, I did everything I could think of. I tightened loose bolts, checked the oil, and jimmied wires. I'd wiped my hands on my jeans so many times they looked like I'd rolled around in grease. Finally, after enough coaxing and more than a few choice words, the engine turned over, rumbling to life like a small miracle. I felt a wave of relief hit me, and I had to let out a laugh as I stood there, arms crossed, watching that engine run. That old machine, for all its faults, had decided to work today. Just as I was wiping off my hands, I saw my wife coming out of the house, the soft morning light catching her hair as she wrapped her shawl tight around her. She'd been up for just a few minutes, but looked fresh as ever. I watched her head toward the cows, ready to milk them and take them out to graze, just as she did every morning. She looked over at me with a sleepy smile, and I waved back, feeling a bit lighter than I had in days. Maybe, just maybe, things were falling into place. At 8 a.m., I started calling every number I had, anybody who might be interested in buying an old truck. I told them I got a deal they couldn't pass up, saying it was sturdy and reliable. The words felt like they turned to dust in my mouth, but I had to keep trying. A couple of guys came out to look it over, but each one turned up their nose, claiming the old heap wouldn't make it to the end of the block without breaking down. After each rejection, I felt that bubble of hope deflate a little more. Just when I was about ready to give up, an old man drove up. He must have been 60, maybe 70, a rough-looking guy with hands as worn as the engine he was about to buy. He circled the truck slowly, giving it a careful look, but in the end he shrugged and said, "Well, I don't need it to last forever, just long enough to get me from here to there." He looked at me, nodded, and then reached into his pocket to pull out a thin wad of bills. It wasn't much. $800. Half of what I was hoping for. I felt my gut twist in frustration. I dreamed of that $1,600. But when he met my eyes, there was a quiet understanding between us, and I knew he needed the truck as much as I needed that cash. With a sigh, I nodded, and we made the deal. Once the money was in my hand, I felt a rush of relief, even if it wasn't what I'd hoped for. I headed back to the house, where my wife was already waiting with a hopeful look. She saw the cash, her face lighting up, and within minutes, we were heading into town together. It was a strange, satisfying feeling to be out like this, buying a gift for a party, doing something almost ordinary. After browsing a bit, we finally settled on a gift that seemed just right. A leather-bound notebook and a set of elegant pens. They had the look of something refined, a little luxury wrapped in simple packaging, something that felt as respectable as we hoped to be when we walked in later that day. It cost us about $400, half of what I'd made from the truck, and it felt like a big step, but I didn't regret it. As we drove home, my wife held the package in her lap, running her fingers over the ribbon like it was something precious. She looked over at me with that bright, eager expression, and I realized just how much this small outing meant to her. We didn't get out much, didn't have the luxury of throwing our money around, but today we'd pulled together and made it work. By the time we got back to the house, it was already nearing 1 p.m. We had just enough time to get ourselves ready, putting on the best clothes we owned and preparing ourselves for an afternoon that already felt like a strange dream. As I pulled on my shirt and looked in the mirror, I reminded myself we'd managed to pull this off one way or another. Now all that was left was to walk into Thomas's place, heads held high, ready to make the most of it. Getting ready felt like stepping into another life, one where I wasn't just a man trying to scrape by. I pulled out my best clothes, the ones I kept for only the most important occasions. I'd worn this same shirt to our wedding, to my father's funeral, and to the few other events where I'd wanted to show a little dignity. My wife was doing the same, slipping into her dress, smoothing out the fabric. She looked beautiful, holding her head high with a quiet determination that I admired. The gift sat wrapped and ready on the table, and for a moment, we both just stood there looking at it. Neither of us had ever given anything this fine before, and it felt good, strange, but good. The feeling lingered as we headed out to Thomas's place, the two of us walking side by side with that package in hand, like we were about to offer the man a piece of our pride. As we pulled up to his house, though, the sight that met us felt like a splash of cold water. Expensive cars filled the driveway, sleek, shiny things that probably cost more than I made in a year. Each one looked like a little reminder of where we belonged, and, more importantly, where we didn't. My wife's grip tightened on the gift, and I could see her shift a bit, but I whispered, "We're here. Let's not turn back now." She nodded, giving me a small smile, and together we walked in. The second we stepped through the door, I felt like I'd walked onto the set of some movie. Men in crisp suits stood in groups, laughing too loud, glasses of champagne in their hands, and the women, well, they looked like they'd stepped right out of a fashion magazine. There was this polished, high-end feel in the air, a feeling that said people like us weren't supposed to be here. We were probably the only ones in the room who hadn't come from money. I tried to stand taller, and I could feel my wife straightening beside me, her hand light on my arm. We were out of place, no doubt about it. But we were here, and I wanted her to feel proud, not ashamed. We made our way over to Thomas, where a small mountain of gifts sat on a table beside him. I felt my confidence start to waver when I took a closer look. Everything on that table looked like it cost a fortune. Fancy boxes with gold and silver wrapping, tags from high-end brands, each one a silent reminder of how little we had. A single gift here probably cost more than 2 months of my work. My throat went dry, but I kept my face steady. I handed him the package with a steady grip, meeting his eyes as I did. He took it with a brief glance, his smile polite but thin, and said, "Oh, you shouldn't have. I don't need a gift, but since you've already bought it, I am very grateful." His tone was light, dismissive, like he was talking about some trinket he'd found in a corner store. He placed it down without a second glance, his attention already drifting to the next guest, the next laugh, the next round of backslapping. I glanced at my wife, and my heart sank. Her face had gone pale, and she was staring at the ground, one hand tugging nervously at her dress. I could see the humiliation in her eyes, and she looked like she wanted to disappear. But she held on, her mouth pressed into a thin line, determined not to let her feelings show. I leaned close, squeezed her hand, and whispered, "We did good. Doesn't matter what he thinks." She gave me a shaky nod, and we stood there together, a little out of place, a little bruised, but still holding on to each other. The first hour felt like a challenge, each second dragging out as I watched my wife's discomfort deepen. Her eyes darted around the room, and she looked ready to bolt, but I couldn't let us give up, not after everything we'd done just to be here. I leaned in close, gave her hand a firm squeeze, and whispered, "Let's stay a while. We came here to have a good time. Remember?" She looked at me for a long moment, and though I could see the reluctance in her eyes, she finally nodded. I grabbed a glass from a passing waiter and downed it in one gulp. The burn hit my throat, but it warmed me up too, put a little steel in my nerves. I took her by the hand and led her to the dance floor, where we found a rhythm among the crowd, swaying and laughing with each other. There was something exhilarating about it. The lights, the music, and hell, the idea that tonight we could be anyone we wanted. For a moment, I let myself forget the rusted truck, the overdue bills, and I just danced. Before long, my wife drifted off to chat with Thomas's wife, and I started to make my rounds, figuring I might as well blend in with the crowd. At first, I felt like a fish out of water, but with each new drink, the room seemed to soften, the edges blurring in a way that almost felt welcoming. The words started flowing, and pretty soon I was telling the guys at the bar that I owned a chain of service stations. The lies slipped out easily, a quick, harmless fabrication, but it felt good in the moment. I was one of them, for once, laughing along with their jokes and nodding as they threw around names and numbers like they were talking pocket change. For night, I'd be a big shot too, just another guy living the good life. The highlight came when one of the men, a tall guy with a Rolex that probably cost more than our house, grinned and tossed me the keys to his Porsche 911. "You ever drive one of these?" he asked, that easy, cocky grin telling me he already knew the answer. Plenty of times, I lied smoothly, feeling that same thrill ripple through me as I grabbed the keys. I got behind the wheel, the engine humming with a smooth power I'd only dreamed about. I drove around the lot, feeling the car surge forward with just the slightest touch, hearing it purr under me like a perfectly tuned beast. They joked that I almost took out a pole at one point, but I didn't care. That brief drive felt like a taste of another world, one I'd never thought I'd touch. When I came back inside, my head was buzzing, my face warm from the alcohol and that Porsche high. It felt like I was floating above my own life, watching myself play a role in someone else's story. I scanned the room, looking for my wife, and there she was across the room. She was having the time of her life, glass in hand, laughing loudly and a little too freely. Her cheeks were flushed, and her hair was falling loose around her shoulders. She looked over at me and shouted something about how amazing this all was, throwing her arms up in a tipsy cheer. I grinned, a little amazed at the sight of her. She was always the more reserved one, the one who kept us grounded, but tonight she looked so different, so alive, so uninhibited. We were both swept up in this fleeting illusion of wealth and ease, like we'd somehow slipped the weight of our ordinary lives. And I let myself sink into it, knowing deep down it was only for tonight, but feeling in that moment like maybe we deserved it. Looking back now, I can't believe how naive I was that night. I was so swept up in the thrill of pretending, of feeling like I'd finally made it, like for once my wife and I belonged. I remember laughing, holding a glass of something I could never pronounce, the alcohol warming me up to a point where I almost believed my own lies. Those men around me, with their tailored suits and watches that cost more than my truck, they nodded at me, patted me on the back, listened to me like I was one of them. They asked me why I didn't wear jewelry or drive a flashier car, and I laughed, saying I was tired of the whole game, that I preferred to live under the radar. They laughed too, a knowing laugh, saying they understood that they felt the same way. But now, thinking back on their faces, I wonder if they saw through me from the beginning, if they were humoring me the whole time. I glanced around the room, feeling good, feeling proud even. I spotted my wife across the way, in the corner talking with the man who'd handed me the keys to that Porsche. She was leaning in close, laughing, her eyes bright. I was glad for her. She seemed relaxed, even happy, chatting away with someone who looked like he actually wanted to hear what she had to say. I thought she was having as good a time as I was, that this night was some kind of break from our reality, some kind of reprieve from the hard life we lived. Then the clock ticked on, the music got louder, and the crowd thickened as the party moved into its final hours. People had that gleam in their eyes that came with too much champagne and too many secrets. It was the kind of energy that's dangerous if you look too close. A man nearby raised his glass, his voice booming above the music. He was making a toast to Thomas, his voice loud and cheerful, praising Thomas's success, his generosity, his friendship. I thought I should find my wife, bring her to join the toast. I scanned the room, expecting to see her face, but she wasn't there. I waited a bit longer, thinking she was in the bathroom. She'd mentioned her stomach was bothering her a little while back, blaming it on the strange food, those dishes with names I couldn't even read. But after a few minutes passed, and she still hadn't returned, that warm buzz in my chest started to fade, replaced by an odd, unsettling feeling. I checked the bathroom, then went back to the main room, weaving through the clusters of people laughing, drinking, carrying on. Each time I passed someone new, I heard pieces of conversations, snatches of laughter that suddenly grated on my ears. Everywhere I looked, I saw strangers, and my wife was nowhere to be found. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't starting to panic. It's like a cold weight settled into my stomach, a kind of heavy dread that I didn't understand yet. I went out to the patio, thinking she might have stepped outside for some air, but all I saw were couples leaning into each other, talking quietly under the dim lights. No sign of her. Each minute that passed felt like an eternity, and I kept telling myself she'd turn up any second, but she didn't. I'm writing this now, for months later, and even now my hands are shaking, my stomach twisting, just remembering it. Because what I found that night, what I saw when I finally did find her, it's burned into my mind like a scar. I thought I'd left that moment behind me, but it haunts me, and I don't know how to shake it. Nothing could have prepared me for what came next. Nothing. I'll never forget that walk through Thomas's house. Room after room, my heart pounding harder each time I opened a door to find a stranger staring back at me. Laughter and music in the background like nothing was wrong. I must have looked like a madman, barging into rooms, scanning faces, calling her name over and over. Every time it was just another group of people oblivious to the panic building in my chest. My mind raced, but a sick, nagging feeling told me exactly where to go. The third floor was quieter, away from the main crowd, and it was there, at the end of the hall, that I heard it. The unmistakable sound of someone moaning. Voices low, whispers blending together in a rhythm that made my skin crawl. I stopped cold in front of the closed door, heart thudding in my chest. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, finding it locked. I banged my fist on the door, my voice rough as I shouted, "Open up! Open the damn door!" The voices went silent. I hit the door harder, yelling now, shouting her name, but still, silence on the other side. The panic morphed into something dark and desperate, a kind of rage I'd never felt before. I didn't care who saw or who heard. I was done waiting. With every ounce of strength I had, I threw myself against the door, again and again, feeling the wood start to splinter under my shoulder. Just as the frame gave way, I heard footsteps behind me, voices rising in alarm. But I didn't care. I wasn't stopping until I got that door open. The first person to reach me was Thomas. He grabbed my shoulder, shouting, "Albert, what the hell are you doing? This is my house." I barely registered his words, brushing him off, my voice breaking as I yelled back, "My wife! Someone's in there with my wife!" His eyes widened, but I barely saw it. With one last push, the door burst open, the frame splintering as I stumbled inside. There they were, the man standing by the bed, pulling on his suit jacket, his face flushed and his shirt half-buttoned. My wife stood a few feet away, dressed, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else that I can only call shame. The bed between them was a mess. Sheets crumpled, pillows thrown to the floor, the evidence of what they'd done lying plain as day before me. My heart shattered in a way I didn't know was possible. I could barely find the words, barely breathe as I looked from her to him. The man, this guy who'd let me drive his Porsche, who I'd shared drinks and jokes with not an hour before, had the audacity to look confused, even annoyed. He frowned and said, "What the hell, Albert? Why'd you break down the door?" I stared at him, then back at her, my voice a choked whisper that rose into a shout. "Why? Why? That's my wife." My voice echoed, ragged, broken. I could barely get the words out as I looked at her, my hands shaking, rage and hurt twisting in my gut like a knife. "What were you doing? Why did you do this? Why did you cheat on me?" The man stood there, stunned, his face slack with shock. She told me she wasn't married," he stammered, taking a step back, eyes darting between the two of us. My wife just stood there, looking down at the floor, tears running down her face. She didn't try to explain, didn't try to defend herself. Just stood there, her shoulders shaking, her hands covering her mouth as she tried to choke back sobs. I felt like I was losing my mind, felt the room spinning around me as the weight of her betrayal crushed down. The anger boiled over, and I shouted at her, voice thick with bitterness. "So, this is what you wanted, huh? Some rich fool to sweep you off your feet? Was all of this a joke to you?" My words came out raw, unfiltered, every ounce of pain and betrayal pouring out of me. Behind me, I could feel the eyes of everyone else who'd followed the commotion upstairs. They crowded in the doorway, their faces a blur of shock, curiosity, and judgment. No one said a word. No one moved. They just watched like we were putting on a show for them, a real-life spectacle unfolding before their eyes. Finally, she looked up, her tear-streaked face full of something I'd never seen before. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth, but the words that came out were a punch straight to the gut, words I never saw coming. "Albert, I didn't mean for you to find out this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible, breaking on the last words. The room spun, and I felt the ground slip out from under me. The words that came out of her mouth cut deeper than I could ever describe. She was shouting, her face twisted with anger, the tears streaming down her cheeks, doing nothing to soften the venom in her voice. "I'm tired, Albert," she cried, her voice sharp and raw. "I'm tired of scraping by, of being stuck in that little house, taking care of those damn cows every day. I want more. I want to live a real life. I want a man who can give me everything I deserve." Her words echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls and crashing right into me, each one a fresh stab to the heart. I felt hollowed out, gutted, like every part of my life that I'd worked so hard to build was crumbling right in front of me. And then, from somewhere behind me, I heard it, someone muttering, "Didn't he say he had all these businesses? Said he was rich." Another voice scoffed, "Rich? He's a nobody, barely scraping by. Must have been a load of crap." I could feel my face burning, a mix of humiliation and anger turning my blood to fire. I didn't want them to know. I didn't want anyone to see just how small and pathetic I felt at that moment. I had lied, sure, but it was supposed to be harmless. It was a way to hold my head up for one night, to feel like I was worth something more. And now they knew. Now they all knew. My wife kept shouting, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "I'm done living off $1,000 a month, Albert. I'm done being nobody. Look at this house, these people. This is how I want to live. I want more than what you'll ever be able to give me." Her words hung in the air, the final nail in the coffin of everything I thought we'd built together. I felt anger swelling in my chest, mixing with the deep shame, the realization that every person in that room now saw me for exactly what I was. I couldn't stand there another second. I felt my fists clench, and a fury like I'd never known pushed me to turn away. I had to get out. I shoved past the people crowding around the doorway, their shocked faces blurring as I pushed through, and all I could think was that I needed to escape, to be anywhere but here. Thomas was standing by the stairs, his face tight with confusion, watching as everything spiraled out of control in his own home. He looked at me, but I didn't stop. I barely registered the concern in his eyes. I just needed air. I needed to get far away from this place. The moment I stepped out into the yard, I saw it, the Porsche 911, shining under the porch lights like some kind of answer. The keys were still in the ignition, and without a second thought, I ran to it. The leather seats creaked as I climbed in, the engine roaring to life with a powerful hum. I gripped the wheel, and for a second, I stared straight ahead, my mind blank, my heart pounding. Then I pressed the gas, hard, peeling out of the driveway, the tires screeching as I tore down the road, away from that place, away from her. The speedometer climbed, the numbers rising as I pushed the Porsche faster and faster, the engine roaring as it responded to my anger, my shame. The road was a blur beneath me, trees flashing past, headlights slicing through the night. I was flying down that road, pushing 150, my foot planted on the gas, my grip white-knuckled on the steering wheel. I felt a scream rising in my throat, raw and broken, and I let it out, shouting into the empty night, my voice mingling with the roar of the engine. I screamed for all the lies, for all the years I'd spent scraping by, thinking it was enough. I screamed for the future I'd thought we'd had together, the one that had shattered in an instant. I could barely see through the tears blurring my vision, my chest heaving with sobs that I couldn't hold back anymore. My whole world, everything I thought I'd been building for us, was gone. The only thing I could hear was her voice, still ringing in my ears, her words burning into my mind. If I hadn't gone to that damn party, if I hadn't let myself get swept up in the lie, if I hadn't, maybe things would still be the way they were. But there was no going back now. When I finally came home, my whole body was shaking, my hands, my legs, everything trembling from anger and heartbreak. I slammed the door behind me and stumbled into the living room, collapsing into a chair, my head in my hands as I let the full weight of everything crash down on me. All I could hear were her words echoing in my mind, each one more bitter, more painful than the last. The anger that had burned so hot on the drive home turned to something else, a hollow, heavy despair that settled into my chest like a stone. I'd taken the Porsche in a blind rage, driven it to the edge of what it could handle, and now I couldn't bring myself to care about the consequences. My phone kept buzzing in my pocket, Thomas calling, texting, telling me to bring the car back, warning me that things would only get worse if I didn't. I knew he was probably right, but what did it matter now? My wife, my home, my life, everything felt ruined beyond repair. In that haze of anger, I grabbed the nearest picture frame, one of those memories of us smiling, arms around each other, and hurled it at the wall. The glass shattered, sending shards flying across the room. I grabbed another frame, and then another, smashing each one, watching as the pieces of our life together scattered across the floor. I tore through the house like a storm, grabbing anything that held the slightest bit of sentimental value and ripping it apart. The memories burned as I tore them to shreds, and when I ran out of things to break, I grabbed the stack of photos we'd saved over the years and threw them into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed them, each image curling and blackening until they were nothing but ash. I even thought about burning the whole damn place down, letting the flames take every last reminder of her with it. But somewhere, a part of me knew that would be the final nail, the last step down a road I could never come back from. So I sat there, in the wreckage of everything we'd built, and waited. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for the car. And for me, it wasn't half an hour before I heard them. Engines rumbling up the drive, the low murmur of voices outside. I could barely breathe, bracing myself for whatever came next, feeling too broken to even care if they came to tear me apart. I just sat there, slumped in a chair in the mess I'd made, feeling as empty as the room around me. The door burst open, and Thomas strode in, his face flushed, his eyes blazing with fury. He didn't hold back, his voice booming, each word like a slap. "You're an idiot, you know that? Taking a Porsche like that? You could have gotten into an accident, or worse, hit someone else. Do you even realize what you did?" I looked up at him, feeling the words hit, but unable to respond. I didn't have the strength to argue, didn't have anything left to say. All I could do was stare back at him, my eyes raw from crying, the words catching in my throat as I tried to speak. Finally, I managed to choke out, "Where is she, Thomas? Where's my wife? I need to see her." Thomas's face shifted, some of the anger fading, replaced by something almost like pity. He shook his head, his voice quieter now, softer but still firm. "She doesn't want to come back here, Albert. She's not coming back." The reality of it hit me harder than I expected. I'd hoped, in some irrational corner of my mind, that maybe she'd come home, that maybe she'd say she was sorry, that somehow we'd find a way through this. But now I saw it for what it was, a delusion, a fantasy that I'd clung to in the face of everything she'd said and done. The rage flared again, a last, desperate surge, and I grabbed my phone, hurling it across the room. It smashed against the wall, pieces scattering across the floor, and for a moment, there was silence, a calm in the wreckage. Then, from the doorway, I saw him, the man from the Porsche, standing there, his face lined with something that looked almost like regret. He looked at me, taking in the shattered phone, the broken frames, the torn photos. He stepped forward slowly, his voice measured, almost gentle. "I didn't know," he said, his tone sincere. "I didn't know you were married. She told me she wasn't with anyone, that she was free." I stared at him, feeling the bitterness well up inside me, but I couldn't bring myself to hate him. He'd been caught up in this mess just as much as I had, lied to, deceived by the same woman I thought I'd spend my life with. He stood there, looking at me with a kind of sorrow, and I saw that he wasn't the villain I'd wanted him to be, just another player in a story neither of us had written. He went on, his voice low, almost apologetic. "Look, I know this doesn't mean much now, but I'm sorry. If I'd known, I would have never. I cut him off, my voice barely more than a whisper. I don't blame you. Not anymore. I looked away, the weight of everything settling in, an ache that felt like it would never leave. I never thought I'd end up here, that this would be my life. He gave me a small, sad nod, and after a moment, he turned to leave, his footsteps soft against the floor. Thomas followed, pausing at the door to look back at me, his expression a strange mix of anger, pity, and something almost like understanding. As they left, I sat alone in the ruins of my home, the silence pressing in around me. There was nothing left to break, nothing left to burn, just the emptiness, the ashes, and the hollow, aching truth that everything I thought I had was gone. Those days after they left blurred together, the hours bleeding into each other until I wasn't sure if it was day or night. I sat in that house, the silence as thick as the anger that settled into my bones. The Mercedes was still parked out front, a sleek, black reminder of everything that had happened. But I couldn't even look at it, let alone think about what it meant. The only thought that kept looping in my head was her betrayal. The way she'd looked at me, shouted at me, like she couldn't care less if I was hurt, humiliated, destroyed. I was angry with her, sure, but there was something deeper, too, an emptiness that swallowed up every other feeling. I'd built my life with her. I'd made plans, worked my hands to the bone to give us even a small bit of comfort, and she'd tossed it aside like it was nothing. She didn't apologize, didn't even try to explain, just gone like all of it had meant less than nothing. After a few days, I started to feel the hollow gnaw of hunger. The fridge was empty, but I hadn't had the will to leave the house. Food didn't matter. Nothing did. I barely moved, just sat there, staring at the walls, the mess I'd made in my anger. I was a wreck, and I knew it. Then one afternoon, there was a knock on the door. I barely had the strength to stand, but I opened it, and there he was, the man I'd hated and then pitied, the one who'd unwittingly broken my life apart. He had a bag of groceries in one hand and an envelope in the other. I didn't know what to say, just stared at him, too numb to react. He looked at me with that same mix of regret and something almost like compassion, and for the first time I felt a strange kind of relief. Someone knew. Someone understood what this had done to me. He set the groceries on the counter and said, "I thought you could use some help." He handed me the envelope. "There's $10,000 in there. I know it doesn't make up for anything, but maybe it'll help you get back on your feet." I looked down at the money, stunned. $10,000 felt like a fortune, something that could pull me out of the pit I was in. Before I could even think to refuse, he held up his hand, stopping me. "And the car outside? The Mercedes? That's yours now. Consider it my way of trying to make things right, at least in some way." I nodded slowly, unable to find words, and he went on. "Look, I can see how this has gutted you. If it's any help, I have a place for you in the city, a job that pays well enough. You don't need to stay here. Not in this house, not with these memories." He looked around, taking in the destruction, the remnants of what used to be my life. "Sell it, move on, start fresh. I'll help however I can." I listened to him, and somewhere in the back of my mind, his words started to make sense. This house, this town, they were just ghosts now, reminders of everything I'd lost. The thought of leaving, of stripping myself of the past and starting somewhere new, felt like breathing for the first time. I agreed. I would sell the house, take the job, and try to piece together some kind of life. And so, a week later I did. I sold the house and everything in it. And with the money he'd given me, I found a small place in the city, took the job at his company, working in a royalty office for a simple wage. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was honest, and for the first time, I could breathe without feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. It's been 4 months now, 4 months since that night that shattered everything. I'm writing this now, looking back, trying to make sense of it all. In the meantime, my ex-wife has reached out, pregnant, she says, carrying my child. She's asking me to come back, to be there for the baby. But every time I think of her, of the way she humiliated me, of the life she threw away, I feel that same old anger rising up. I can't forgive her. Not now, maybe not ever. I've told her I'll agree to alimony, that I'll help in any way I can, but there's no going back to what we once had. This new life isn't easy, and the scars are still fresh, but I'm starting to believe I can make it on my own. The betrayal, the anger, they're still there, but they're fading, becoming part of the past. And with each day, I'm learning to let them go, piece by piece.